Hi, it's Ed D'Agostino from the future, and I'm dropping in real quick before we start to just say we had some slight audio problems with Amy in this interview. I apologize in advance if it's a little bit annoying, but I have to say you do absolutely need to watch this video on energy, on digital security, on cybersecurity. It was a fascinating conversation. Thanks for checking in. Hello and welcome back to another Global Macro Update. My name is Ed D'Agostino from Malden Economics, and I am so pleased to be welcoming Amy Myers-Jaffe. She joins us today. She's the author of an excellent book, which you'll see over my shoulder, Energy's Digital Future. Harnessing Innovation for American Resilience and National Security. She's also a research professor and managing director of the Climate Policy Lab at Tufts University, Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and she is a past speaker at our Strategic Investment Conference. So, Amy, welcome back. It's great to be with you again.
Great to be here. It's such a difficult time for markets.
It's a difficult time for markets, and it's such an intriguing and challenging time for energy, especially with record-breaking heat in the heartland of the U.S. and even more so in Europe, and the big black swan that happened earlier this year with Russia invading Ukraine. I'm very curious what your thoughts are on kind of the short-term implications of that for the world and energy supply, and then what does that event do to the energy transformation that was already underway? Does it accelerate it? Does it stall it? What are your thoughts kind of on the whole Russia-Ukraine impact on the globe?
Well, of course, we've seen these giant impacts in commodity markets, with Europe increasing its purchases and the impact that that's had on different price points, whether that's the price point for liquefied natural gas cargoes. We've seen, of course, this giant surge in oil prices coming off a little bit now, coal prices, uranium prices, I mean, you name it. And in oil, I think one of the most interesting aspects of the commodity push is how do you separate the risk, the future risk, from the actual reality of the market. So one of the things that I've noticed of late is that the numbers of the reality of the market are quite different than what the price levels or the sort of speculative furor would have led you to believe, because when we started February, March, we lost about 1.5 million barrels a day of Russian crude oil into the market because countries either put on a ban, which some of those countries, it wasn't so large, but you had big players, European players, trading houses, others, decide that they didn't want to handle the commodity. And then you saw this shifting in the market. And lo and behold, we get to the April-May statistics, and India's purchases from Russia for crude oil are up to 1.1 million barrels a day, and China's purchases of crude oil from Russia are up 400,000 barrels a day. And bingo, that's the 1.5 million barrels a day. So I would say at this moment in time, there actually is no Russian crude oil disruption, but you do have the 1 million barrels a day coming from the SPR. You have the higher oil flows coming from the US shale patch. So I feel like the crude oil market's very lofty compared to the actual fundamentals of, is demand really that strong? No. And you have all this sort of really literally undisrupted supply. So then you're really just 100% talking about the risk. Do you think there's a risk that more of Russia's oil is going to come off the market, or some other oil is coming off the market? But in natural gas, I think the risk is a little bit more evident, where the latest force majeure by Gazprom on European buyers is real. The disruption to the natural gas system, whether that's inventory builds across Europe that may or may not happen because of the geopolitical element, having that change, who is and isn't buying LNG and when, what price, A lot of talk about, China, Russia, energy alliances, but again, there's a little bit of smoke and mirrors there because the Chinese have committed to a huge amount of long-term contracts for the third wave, what we call the third wave of U.S. LNG, the new plants coming on, or the capacity that wasn't committed. About a third of that is going to China. So they're obviously not planning to 100% lock down on Russia at the exclusion of the United States. So you have sort of like the sort of emotional response to the risk that is there in Russia. You have the real challenge for Europe to come up with supplies, whether that's turning back on coal or other kinds of things. Then we have the heat wave and drought, which can mean we have to turn down nuclear because we don't have cool water to use to cool the fuel. So we have real disruptions. So the price pain in the European markets are quite strong and quite real. But when we come to the sort of global picture, maybe it's not fundamentally as strong as the speculative markets would indicate.
Amy, you brought up China, and it's interesting that they're not really they're not showing up in the news as much as you would think they would right now with regard to energy. But I found what was one of the things I found so interesting in your book is how in the past energy contributed to wealth significantly for nations. Basically, if you had oil, you were likely to be an incredibly wealthy nation, and if you didn't, you weren't as likely. Can you explain what you mean by digital energy and how China is perhaps well ahead of the rest of the world in that space?
Yes, I mean, very important point because in the new transformational energy world, geography, that is the geography of resources, is going to matter less than the ingenuity of machinery. So when I talk about digital, I'm talking about systems of equipment that are utilizing, computerization or automation, AI, big data, and how that will transform how we use and how we produce energy. So in the case of China, they have committed to everything from electric vehicles. They have a big program on drones. They have a big program on automated cars. So you have self-driving cars, self-driving buses, self-driving trucks. When it comes to drones, we think of small drones. But China's moving forward on these passenger drones that can move people in cities from one tower to another, one skyscraper to another. They have experimental solar energy roads where the road itself generates solar energy, but then if you drove an electric car over it, somehow some kind of automated wireless system where it would charge the car. And of course,
Wow.
China is now leading in battery technology, which also plays into the sort of more digitized electricity system where I can use solar energy or some kind of localized energy, and then I can store that energy in a battery, whether that's at the household level or at the utility scale level. So China's really made this push, this government push with public spending and assistance to companies. They have made this a national priority to dominate in this new energy space and advanced vehicle space. And it's a space where oil and gas will matter less.
So China being a centrally controlled economy, you could argue that they have an advantage over us, at least in this particular time when we seem to be so polarized and can't really get out of our own way politically. What what can the U.S. do and should the U.S. do to compete and keep pace, if not dominate, like we have in the past century with regard to energy?
Well, the good news is that we did pass the infrastructure bill, which everybody seems to forget when we, always talking about what hasn't happened in the last 2 months or 4 months, but we did pass the infrastructure bill. You know, that was a lot of, 60, $70 billion is a lot for the US economy to absorb at any time. And indeed, it's much higher than the ARA, 2009 stimulus, which did lead to a lot of progress in the US with things like Tesla, and utility scale solar. For Solar as a company. There are a lot of American companies that are big names today that benefited from the stimulus back in 2009. So this is going to be the same thing. And luckily, the one thing that's truly bipartisan in the United States has been, thankfully, spending on research and development. So where I think we could really play more strongly in the United States is in what we call public-private partnerships, and we saw that with COVID, right? Where the US government gets behind with the private sector and has an initiative to fast track something and make sure the United States is leading both in the technology development and in its deployment. And so, of course, we saw that with vaccines, but we could see that with hydrogen. We could see that with EVs. We could see that with automation of vehicles. That's a dual-use military thing. If the Chinese are doing advanced drones and the Chinese are doing advanced vehicles, then the Pentagon needs to be doing those things as well. And, I try to remind people, and I have a whole section on the history of this in the book, we only have GPS because the US government was worried about the launch of the satellite Sputnik by Russia, then the USSR, the Soviet Union. And so we developed this technology to be able to track that satellite. And indeed, many years later, it becomes available to the private sector. And now we have all kinds of companies and jobs being created in the United States where people are commercializing different applications of GPS. And the military continues to try to dominate in its use of GPS in national security. Same thing with automated vehicles. People don't realize this. The Pentagon had a contest years ago who could create a vehicle that could do a test track in the Mojave Desert. And people came from around the world, stayed here in the United States. We had our own American universities like Stanford and Carnegie Mellon and others enter vehicles. And all those people who worked on that contest are literally the people you hear about moving from Uber to Apple, from Apple to Google, the Waymo car. All of the personnel that started those projects literally started on that Pentagon contest. So having a real strategic American focus that would combine public spending and development and the initiative of private industry is really our sweet spot, because China isn't really in that sweet spot. You don't have as many people sitting around in China at 17 years old coming up with a doohickey, and then all of a sudden the venture capital community finds them and they're billionaires. I mean, it's happening some in China, but it happens under a very tight government repressive system that makes it a little bit dangerous to be a successful billionaire in China. So that gives us an advantage that we can really exploit.
You brought up the military and GPS. It seems like the concept of digital energy is it's sort of incorporating old way of thinking about energy, which was just oil or natural gas or electricity.
Something underground, we're going to take some
exactly
that exists in nature, and we're going to tap it and turn it into, basically a energy source for our machines.
Right,
Whereas
and then you add in digital.
We're adding in digital. Now we're going to be able to use some form of energy that exists naturally. We're going to be able to use computerization, data, and artificial intelligence to basically minimize, in a way, the input from this natural resource and maximize the output that we're going to get by adding computers or robotics and so forth to the system. And then, of course, there's this huge power in data. If you think about the heat wave, if I know exactly minute by minute who's using electricity and how, and I want to develop a system of pricing so I can shift the power load in such that I don't have a brownout, you can think of the power of having, your Amazon digital thermostat, knowing exactly what appliance is going on in your house and why, being able to transmit, hopefully privately, that data to the utility, and having the utility know how to incent people to not use electricity when they don't need it, to maximize cooling at a time when it's critical, to shift our load around, or to eliminate a load through technology. So one of the big inventions that we've seen, in the United States that no one realizes exists is companies that do logistics. So, we're talking UPS, Amazon, et cetera.
Mhm.
They all have these big data, artificial intelligence systems. You buy something, the package exists in the system, the computer decides where that package needs to go. It figures out the cheapest way to get it there in terms of grouping packages together. So your delivery driver, people don't realize this. He doesn't make a right turn because he feels like a right turn is the right turn to make. His truck is already programmed. Every package in it is scanned. The truck turns based on the GPS for the plan for the day, based on traffic of how to deliver all those packages to exactly the same place, exactly the right time, and with the most minimal amount of fuel.
Wow,
And
I did not realize that. So you're
right, and
essentially saying that,
it's saving millions and millions of gallons of diesel fuel every year.
and you're saying that essentially that technology, that software approach could be leveraged to scale up at the grid level or the utility level.
Absolutely.
Is it
And
is it
I
far
think
away?
that, yeah, when you hear, I mean, Texas isn't quite doing that yet. Maybe California is farther ahead in that regard because some of these tech companies were based there, and so they've tried to sell, some of these ideas more into the system. But even Texas, if you look at the statistics for battery sales, so battery sales, and by that I don't mean EVs, I mean stationary battery sales for the electric grid. It's a hugely upward sloping graph for the last, say, 5 to 10 years. The last 3 years, it's just like tripled, quadrupled the amount of sales in the United States. So when you analyze the data, the sales are going to exactly where you would imagine: Texas, Florida, California, and Puerto Rico, places that have had the worst disruption to electricity.
Interesting. Okay. What you just described requires a phenomenal amount of big data, data processing, data storage. And I would have to think that a lot of that data in the wrong hands could be quite dangerous. What are
Correct.
the national security and cybersecurity implications of this potential transition that you speak of?
Well, indeed, I mean, that has gotten some focus in Congress because one of the differences between us and China, of course, in China, there's no presumption of personal privacy. And here in the United States, we want to have my personal privacy not only from corporations, but from the government and from foreign governments. So the cyber challenge of having all this aggregated data with all this intensive locational personal data becomes, quite a big cyber challenge. And you can think of it, in a sort of fundamentally, somewhat humorous but not humorous way, which is, suppose somebody wanted to prevent you from getting somewhere. If they have all this data about your vehicle and that was hacked, they could literally change where you're going. If you were in a self-driving vehicle, it could change where the vehicle's taking you. But even for your own self, if you're in your vehicle, there was, one sort of humorous headline about a man getting locked into his Tesla and he couldn't get out because something went wrong with the automation. But you can just imagine, if I multiply that by my car, my home, my television set, like there's so many things that could go wrong. And that is the story. If you let me elaborate for one more minute, that is actually
Sure.
the story of Colonial Pipeline. And we all sort of witnessed this giant gasoline pipeline in the United States that went down for a couple of days. And there was some talk about a cyber blackmail, that they had to pay money to get their data back. But the real risk was not so much that the company lost its financial data, which happens to a routine thing sometimes. What was actually much more dangerous was the company had put in a set of sensors all along the pipeline that regulated its sales and then sent the invoicing information back to their business office. So, in the old days, you had a guy with a piece of paper and he had a lever and he pulled the lever up and down, gave you your gasoline at your terminal, and then took a physical piece of paper and mailed it back to the business office. So if something broke in the pipeline, you could just break off that section for a minute, fix the levers, and then put that section back on. Well, this thing now is computerized from the very first place they put fuel into it till the last place they drop it off in New England. And you could literally, using those sensors, there all kinds of things could go wrong. You could use the safety sensors and turn them off and blow the pipeline up. You could just shut it down, from a distance. You could just mess up all the stuff so you didn't know who was getting what oil and where. And it had national security implications, not only because of the just deep inconvenience to consumers, but because we had military bases that are supplied with fuel, and Washington, D.C. was supplied with fuel by that pipeline. So,
Wow.
The consequence of the fact that Colonial did not have proper privacy and cyber tools in place to make sure that pipeline was properly protected from intrusion was kind of shocking, and highlighted this whole new area of gap where you had strategic assets in the United States that are controlled by the private sector and not by the U.S. government.
Right. It
And
seems like that's a shortfall.
Right.
Right. And as a business, most businesses are driven by bottom line, right? Driven by profits. And so there's a built-in incentive there to, maybe you don't necessarily have to call it cutting corners, but maybe there's just not enough room built into the price to be able to do it fully right. Is that a fair way to say it?
Well, I would say in Colonial's case, there's two issues. The first one was that, a lot of businesses are going to automation to save the cost of labor, but then maybe they're not educated enough to understand what safety procedures they need to put in place to go with that automation. And what does it really mean to have backup? Now I think, especially in the oil industry, people are quite aware that backup means you have a system where you store your data on a disconnected computer. In other words, it's not connected to the internet. It's separated. And actually, we learned to do that from an accident that happened to Maersk, the shipping company, where they were hacked in a very dangerous way. And there was one computer in the company that was down because there was a blackout in Nigeria, and somebody had taken the equipment and turned it off. And that equipment had the data, and therefore the company was spared what could have been millions and millions of dollars in expenses because they could restore the system from this turned off equipment in Nigeria. So people learned then, what needed to be done, because sometimes it's not about, maybe it's almost impossible maybe to have an ironclad piece of equipment in the end, or you can try we've been actually, luckily, pretty successful. But what's more important is, do I understand my backup systems? Do I have a plan, a response plan for bringing the facility back up once I've had some kind of a data breach? Do I know what I would do? Do I have an emergency plan? And in that case, Colonial was quite behind the times.
Wow. Amy, this is a fascinating conversation, and I have about 3 more hours worth of questions for you, but I won't do that to you. But I would love to end with one last question. If you could paint a picture for us. We all have been hearing now for years about some of the things you mentioned: automated cars. We hear about automated trucks on our highways, and now we're starting to hear about not just drones that transport people, but automated drones that transport people. It just seems a little far away. We haven't got the first one yet, and now we're talking about these other things on the spectrum. What's the timeline? I don't know, you don't have a crystal ball, but what do you think the U.S. grid and digital energy looks like in, say, 5 years and in 10 years' time?
Well, in terms of the grid, I think the pressure to improve and to try to turn to technology to improve is just hugely strong right now. And I do see that taking place very rapidly. You know, the software is already there. We know how to deploy batteries. In California, with this latest heat wave, there was actually more energy coming into the market from batteries than from nuclear power. Had been in the past. So, you know, that I think is coming. And I think 5 years from now, that's going to be a more and more prominent trend. Like, it's not going to sound very science fiction-y, 5 years from now. In terms of self-driving in the United States, I think that's been a much slower grind. I think I saw a news story that somebody gave a permit for the first automated platoon of trucks to try and experiment in a dedicated lane in the United States. I think that's just going to try now to start. I think that has more possibility than cars, because cars, people say, well, my Tesla can come from the Tesla parking lot to the front door and it drives itself. And that's true. I've seen them do that trick, on their own property. But the bottom line is, we're just so far away from society managing that I think that's probably not going to happen in the next 5 years, maybe not even within 10. But trucks, you could imagine, on key routes, given the fact that we already are looking at, shortages of drivers and the improvement in fuel efficiency that actually comes from doing that is actually quite large. You could imagine on certain highways where trucks are very prominent and where maybe people would accept this, that you could have a barrier that made a dedicated lane, and you could have automated trucks along that corridor. And indeed, in Europe, there's some talk of making those corridors and having the trucks be electrified from it, the streetcars were in the old days. So I think that technology in 5 years will seem less science fiction and more about where can we deploy that.
So you don't think I'll be taking an air taxi from Connecticut to Midtown Manhattan anytime soon?
They've tried experimenting with them in Dubai and a few other places. It's going to be pretty expensive to put the launch pads, and then you have to have a whole infrastructure. I have to be able to have a dedicated elevator to take me up, and then I have to, I think maybe the first place, if I don't know, for those listeners who are New Yorkers, maybe the first one is going to be from the East Side River to the Hamptons in the summer. Maybe we might see some enterprising person with a drone shuttle doing that. Or maybe, the obvious place that they people had it in mind was to take people around the Bay Area because, it's just so difficult.
Sure.
But haven't seen it. No one's started that as a business yet. So we'll see.
Okay. Well, Amy Myers Jaffe, it's great to have you with us, author of Energy's Digital Future, which is a fantastic book. I highly recommend you pick it up, viewers. Amy, thanks for your time. Really appreciate it.
Glad to be with you.
Thanks for watching this edition of Global Macro Update. If you found it interesting, please take a moment to subscribe. It really does help us bring you more content. We will be delivering new updates every week. This is essential information, and I want to make sure it gets delivered to you as timely as possible. So go ahead and hit that subscribe button, and thanks for watching.